hope after death as believers is. And so just felt very confused about sort of popular images of heaven and conversations about that. And then like this sense of like, well, I know what we talk about at funerals, but then like, and so really misunderstanding the idea of an embodied resurrection and how critical that is to the core of Christian belief. So if you think about Apostles' Creed, if you're in a church that regularly says the Apostles' Creed, right? It's sort of the boiled down to like theologically, what have historically Christians been able to say yes to? And historically, Orthodox Christianity has always affirmed the resurrection of the body. Now the question is, what does that look like, right? So we are, and without sort of getting into all of the nitty-gritty of that, the resurrection of the body has not yet happened, right? So when believers die, the question of what happens kind of in between is a live question that you can all speculate. In Revelation, there's sort of some sense of like disembodied sort of presence of the Lord, but without the fullness of new creation. And so when we think about what is our hope as believers, this is a really, I think, an important and helpful window into the content of our hope, which Paul gets into in 1 Corinthians 15 and says, if Christ hasn't been raised, like this is like all of your hope is in vain, right? That he's the firstborn from among the dead, right? And because Christ is raised, he is the beginning of new creation, right? He's the first fruits, he's the first harvest. So there's a few things I want us to like get back into, but even what Brandon was talking about material, and that is definitely one of the shockers of this passage in Isaiah. And so when we talk about what's happening here in Isaiah, and this is Old Testament, and how are we to kind of understand this, we can understand in a few ways. John, in writing Revelation, draws significantly on Isaiah 60 and 61. The early church would have understood this to be connected to the hope that we have in Jesus. So there's a pretty, I think, easy line, and that's kind of what we've been talking about all along, right? Like, how does the destiny of Zion, like, it's Israel, but then it's like Jesus, sort of this distinct from Israel group, and then how do we understand, like, if we're in Jesus, then we are Zion, and even in this passage, it's like, it's the city, but it's Israel, but it's the temple, right? And all of that tension is just there, right? It just sort of moves around. But we most certainly can say this, that Jesus clearly identifies himself with Zion. And we clearly identify ourselves with Jesus, and Paul makes very easily that leap to say we are here in Christ, you're the new Israel, right? The new people of God. And so Zion is the people of God with God in the city of God. That's the destiny of Zion, right? Does that make sense? Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I can think of Christian traditions that haven't emphasized the body as much.
Yeah.
And definitely affirm a resurrection, but don't think of a bodily resurrection. Like think about the parts of the human being that are like eternal and being separate from like the body that kind of fades away. Do you think that having an understanding of bodily resurrection is made necessary by the passage?
I think it's made necessary by Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians 15. I think it's made necessary, yeah, I do. I think if we understand what happens with Jesus, and if we understand union with Christ as being like really what our salvation is about, right? That because we identify with Christ in his life, death, and resurrection, that the identifying with Christ in his resurrection means that there's bodily resurrection coming. Yeah, and I think there's and we'll talk about this, but there's an important connection between the goodness of creation and the resurrection of the body. That if we sort of get rid of that, then we become sort of Gnostic in our sense of like, well, this is sort of the bad like material world, and what we're really hopeful is sort of an ethereal spiritual world. Yeah, does that make sense? All right, so. New creation's embodied. It is also rich in culture and diversity. I mean, obviously, I'm sure you saw Wealth of Nations, right? Like, shows up over and over again in these passages. It is obviously where Adam Smith got the title of his book, although, yeah, I've never read it, so I cannot comment. I'm sorry to tell you. Yeah, I mean, there's an implication here that, yeah, there is unbelievable diversity, right? And the camels, and what's the passage at the top of?
16.
Yeah, verse 6. A multitude of camels. I heard you guys talking about the camels. Shall cover you, right? And there's this sense of like the things that were readily. It would be like us being like, and like the treasures of Silicon Valley, and and right, like the amazingness that is Mexican food in my own life, and right, like the beauty of Indian architecture, and right, like it is this sense of like when you think of cultures and people groups that have like bring in a particular kind of flavor, richness, yeah, for all of us. So there's a sense of like, if you've traveled the world, which many of you have, you probably have like a reel running in your head of the beauty that you've seen and experienced. And many of you are sort of, are kind of third culture, fifth culture, you know, like caught between immigrant parents and grandparents perhaps who live in the country where your parents are from. Just this like kind of tension of cultures. And the fullness of new creation is a place where all cultures are welcomed and recognized. There's a guy named Richard Mount who wrote a book called, basically on this passage, and he talks about a lot of things, and it's fun and just a little guy, but basically he wrestles with this tension. It's interesting, a generation ago, Christians felt very strange about this because there was culturally this sense of like the world, right, like Babylon, which I think is less a tendency for your generation, but very much like those things are evil. Like Wall Street is evil, right? And we can like blanketly condemn that. And Silicon Valley is evil. And temples to other gods are evil, right? And I think even Paul, it's interesting, Paul gets after this same question in a very different way, talking about food that's been sacrificed to idols. And he says, do you remember what he says? He's like, okay, well, we know idols aren't real. And if you understand that, right, you can receive something, and he sort of sets up a helpful kind of paradigm there. But he says you can receive it as the goodness of creation, right? And so there's this, what happens in new creation is a purging of that which is idolatrous and evil, but a hanging on to the goodness of material creation and the goodness of culture. And so the kings thing is just, kings were representative of their own cultures, right? Like we get that. I love the opening ceremonies to the Olympics. I think they're so fun. It's sort of like new creation, but without Jesus. Right? So, like, but think about it. It's the, like, owls, like, the dress, right? Like, everybody has their designer of choice, and their flag, and there's just, it's very moving. Half the time, there are countries there I'm like, I have never heard of that in my life, right? And just even think of like all the tribes and peoples, right, that don't, are within each of those countries, right? And like the knowledge that God created that and created that kind of diversity, and that is something that comes into the kingdom. And John picks up that exact same language in Revelation, and he says, the kings bring their glory into it. And right, glory language is image-bearing language. Image-bearing language is participation in creation. It is, we are co-creating in culture, right? You guys are co-creators. All of you have a trillion talents and interests, right? And you're participating with God in this creation act that in some crazy way, and I have no idea how it works, I think that gets preserved. I think it gets brought in, right, to new creation. So sort of my last question to you guys on there, which I'm sure none of you got to, is that how does this change how we think about our work? how we think about our engagement with culture, how we think about art, right? If that stuff comes into new creation. Yeah.
I was thinking about how that applies to non-believers or people who don't wind up being saved, because presumably their work also gets preserved.
Yeah.
Like you can't have somebody's, like, if you're somebody's child and you've been raised by them, you like
Yeah.
have ideas that come from them, and then if they like don't put them for whatever reason, you're still there.
Yeah.
Which seems like a profound grace on God's part to like preserve
Yeah.
so many things from so many people
Yeah.
who like turn away from
Yeah. 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 Yeah, and again, like, I don't know how that works, but there does very much seem to be this sense of things being purged as they're brought in, right? So if you look at verse 9 of chapter 60, I love 8 and 9 because it's kind of surprising to me. It's like this fun little rhetorical question. Who are these that fly like a cloud and like doves to their windows? So there's a sense of like peering out, right? For the coastlands shall hope for me. The ships of Tarshish first, which is a reference to, it's unclear if it was an actual thing or like a kind of like a mythological symbol of pagan culture and power.
Tarshish.
Yes. And specifically the ships, because that actually shows up and is condemned at other points in Isaiah. So it's like interesting that that language is being like expressly kind of used. And to bring your children from afar, their silver and gold with them. Right? So there's this using those symbols and presumably negative symbols of culture in gathering of God's people. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's a powerful image to think about. Even think about, right, Jonah sort of goes on a ship to Tarshish, right? Like the very thing that sort of allows him to escape from God's presence is the thing that's bringing the children back. It's the reverse of the Jonah story in some ways. But yeah, it's curious to me how that will all work. We'll see. Okay, so rich in culture and diversity. It's a place where Yahweh is everything to everyone, right? Which is the 1 Corinthians 15 kind of passage. So we get this at the end of verse 16, the verse we were referencing about the kind of strange language ends with, "You shall know that I, the Lord, am your Savior and your Redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob." So even when there seems like a nationalistic thread, it's always towards the knowledge of God, right? Not the fame of Israel in and of themselves, right? It's deeply connected to Israel's God. And so that's where I think that the blurriness of Zion is important, because in some ways, like, the destiny of the people of God is so closely tied with the reputation of their God, of our God, right? But that's so on display here. Okay. It's also a place of cultural redemption, and kind of talked about that. Even, I mean, what's interesting here is one of the things that doesn't get brought in, right? There's nothing that's symbolic of war.
And it supposedly says there's going to be peace.
Yeah. And we get that in Isaiah 2, right? That they'll beat their swords into, right, plowshares. That this is the follow-up to Isaiah 2, which is a city where culture and commerce and relationship are happening and worship is happening, but where war is not, where people are deeply connected to each other. It's the hope of the RNC. It's the hope, hopefully, it's the hope of the DNC, right? I heard some clip, I was just telling Tyler, I have not been listening very much, but I heard a clip of a woman who was like introducing Bernie Sanders. And she was like, this movement is about love. And I was just like, wow, if you pulled this audio out and stuck it, like I mean, it is religious language so often. Political language is so often religious language because it's language of hope, right? And if that's where your hope is, then it inevitably gets infused right? It just makes sense. We're people of hope. We're hoping for some version of the future that is different than what is now, right? And politics is nothing if not that, right? And we're in a time where that's even more, I think, evident to us. Have you guys noticed that though? Yeah, what a weird time. Just bizarre. All right. Sorry. Okay. It's also communal, right? Verse 14. The sons of those who afflicted you shall come bending low to you, and all who despise you shall bow at your feet, which sounds, again, nationalistic. They shall call you it's not individual. They shall call you the city of Yahweh, the Zion of the Holy One of Israel, right? That there's every time there's something that smacks a little bit of some sort of like praise of the people of God, it's immediately connected to their identification with Yahweh, which I just think is incredibly important and also helpful in as we think about what it looks like to serve as servants of God, that people confusing us with God is not only normal, it shouldn't be fearful to us, right? In the sense of as we think about what it looks like to embody God, right? To actually do what we're called to do, to image bear well, right? That category is just taking up the mantle of representation, right? And we can tell we're doing it well, right, when it moves them more closely to understanding of who God is, right? That Zion is blurry because the people of God are meant to look like God, right? And when people experience the people of God, they're meant to experience the truth of who God is. Right? And then it's not about us. And yet it is about us. It's extravagant in beauty. I think there's crazy amounts of beauty language here. Like, verse 7, I will beautify my beautiful house. Verse 9, I know, it's a lot of beauty. Because he has made you beautiful. Verse 13, the glory of Lebanon shall come to you to beautify the place of my sanctuary, and I will make the place of my feet glorious. So there's this sort of extravagant beauty in the city of God. Like Zion is captivating in your experience of it. This is where our imaginations, I think, are helpful and important, right? That think about if all of the most fantastic, amazing pieces of art and architecture and music, and think about your sort of most transcendent moment with culture, with a human being, right? All of this gets brought into the city and magnified. Right? There's this purification that happens in which I think that beauty, one of the reasons we're so obsessed with beauty is it smacks of the eternal. Right? C.S. Lewis talks about that sense of like being exposed to something beautiful and it like hurting. Right? Like you loving it, but it also creating this sort of like, it's so beautiful it hurts. He called it Sehnsucht, right, which is the German kind of term that essentially means it brings up a lot of longing, right? And so this idea of like, there's kind of the objects of that which we have longed for is realized in the city of God, right? Yeah.
I mean, the question that you asked about how it influences our work now, it's just, all of this is like beautiful, but it's like to come. And so much of this,
Yes.
so much of what's happening here is like God doing things for his people, God renaming things, God blessing his people again. Like there's not much that Israel is doing in Zion. There's not much that Zion is actually doing. Like what is the job of Zion? Like it just is it this
What's
beautiful
the
platonic
job
ideal of the
description?
world that is something that we try to implement it here?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah. Any thoughts? Yeah.
It feels like almost so extravagant, like individualistic.
Yeah. Did you hear what Kelly said? She said it feels so extravagant, it's kind of like individuals don't matter. And in some sense, I think that's a good check on us. Like, we are in a culture where individual achievement is the achievement, right? And this is very much a culture where, like, national achievement comes under, like, kingship. And there's a sense of, like, so some of you may be from even cultures where that's much more common, that anything you've done reflects on your community and vice versa, right? So I think there is very much that sense of like even stewardship and ownership within a community. That's maybe a good check, I think, on our own desire to be like, what am I kind of bringing? Because much of how we talk about eternity, right, is like, do you think there will be like my favorite food there? Do you think my dog will be there? You know, not that that's not an important question, but it's difficult to discern. Apparently there are animals there, so I think that's a good sign if you're burning up in that question. But kind of that idea of like salvation is into a people, right? That we never are saved apart from the people of God. And so, yeah, I do think there's a sense in which our achievement, and maybe even to remind ourselves of that as we pursue, career and ambition, that like God has, what you have, God's given you, and you're stewarding it before Him and for the blessing of the world. But I think to answer your question, Al, I think that's where there's this sense of ingathering, right? Kind of early on. Lift up your eyes and see, in verse 4, they all gather together, they come to you. Your son shall come from afar, your daughter shall be carried on the hip, right? And then there's in verse 6, like all of these, they shall bring gold and frankincense, they shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord. They shall come with acceptance on my altar, right? So I think there is a very clear suggestion that everyone's like, there's a possibility of bringing things with you, and that's the culture-making category, right? The wealth of nations is the culture-making category. It's the kings shall bring their glory into it. And by kings, right, like we talk about this all the time, that kingship is a designation of role, right, and of power. And so in a very real sense, right, kingship is not just like I wonder what Barack Obama is going to bring to the new kingdom, right? It is like we are all like exercising dominion, and in doing so, eligible for that kind of lasting, I think, participation in the city. Yeah, Brandon.
One question our group had earlier was
Yeah.
about just the understanding of justice in relation to Israel's sin and then Israel's punishment,
Yeah.
and now Israel's resurrection.
Yeah.
And it seems like the justice that's being done in this restoration is
Mhm.
justice of like crimes done against Israel that now are being restored. But
Yeah.
it doesn't really say a lot about whether Israel has now started to like turn the other way and started to like do good.
Yep.
And whether they're even like deserving of this
Yep.
like restoration, or if
Yep.
they're still doing idols
Totally.
and God's just kind of restoring kind of the
Totally.
excessive
Yep.
brutality they face.
That's a great question.
So I'm just not
Yeah.
really sure how that works.
So for Israel, okay, so we're talking post-exilic Israel. They very much had a sense that we have atoned for our sins. Exile atoned for our sins.
Right.
Now that gets tricky,
They-
doesn't it?
like,
And it's about to get tricky. So that's a good segue, Brandon, thank you. Turn to chapter 63. This is where it's like, oh man, we could have just ended with 62 and it would have been great. And then we start 63. Who is this who comes from Edom in crimson garments from Basra? He who is, which are just kind of symbolic of places that are actually enemies of Israel. He who is splendid in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. And then whoever this is speaks, it is I, speaking in righteousness, mighty to save. And then this question, why is your apparel red and your garments like his who treads in the winepress? And then he answered, I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. I trod them in my anger, trampled them in my wrath. Their lifeblood spattered on my garments and stained all my apparel, for the day of vengeance was in my heart, and my year of redemption had come. I looked, but there was no one to help. I was appalled, but there was no one to uphold. So my own arm brought me salvation, and my wrath upheld me. I trampled down the peoples in my anger. I made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. Whoa. Right? Sounds like Revelation, actually. Just before the new creation passage, the rider with the white horse, right? Similar idea of someone coming in with their garments stained with blood. This is a judgment oracle, right? And it's a judgment oracle that is personified for the first time. And personified with this lone figure, which is interesting. So what do we make of this? Any thoughts? Yeah, John.
So I guess sort of connected to the previous chapters in 60 to 62.
Good.
Jesus in Luke quotes 61
Mm-hmm.
and says this is fulfilled in a present tense sense, not in a
Yes, today this has
Today.
been fulfilled
Yeah.
in your hearing. Mhm.
So part of me makes it sound without getting too much in different premillennial, amillennial, kind of eschatology stuff. 60 to 62 is more just talking about what Christ has done than the final kind of judgment sort of stuff. And so we should think of that as 60 to 62 is more present tense future
Yeah.
almost. And then that then 63 is getting into more final judgment kind of stuff. And then 65 or whatever is then final redemption. Or now that could be a very excessively linear reading of the whole thing. But yeah.
Yeah, it's so tricky. I think the most challenging part of this is where are we? Right? We're trying to sort through it out.
Is it not possible though that 60 through 62 and even in terms of 63, it's it could be applied to Christ's sacrifice, but there's a more perfect version. You read this passage and there's always, until you get to the final end, there's always a more perfect version of what this could be.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's not just applicable to one temporal span of time. This
Yeah.
time, it's maybe even maybe this kind of passage that you keep reading in.
Mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah. No.
You keep reading that and knowing that, not that things will get better, but that there's still hope in some form.
Yep. Yeah. No, I actually think that is pretty much where I would come down in this sense. I think this is a passage about the day of the Lord, right? And the day of the Lord gets applied to several different things in Scripture. It gets applied to, some instances of judgment. So it actually gets applied to when they are taken to Babylon. It gets applied to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, right? So after Jesus has come, resurrected, ascended. So Jesus warns them about that. It also gets applied to kind of the final day of judgment. So there is, without coming down, so to tell you a little of the church history of this, a bunch of the church fathers were this is clearly Jesus. And then Calvin was no, it's not. So there's a lot of conversation, and now most commentaries are that's not Jesus, right? So there's a lot of question about it's just a figure, it's just this is God, and certainly God enacting judgment. And interestingly, enacting judgment in the failure of image bearers, right? One of the things that's so obvious here is that he's alone, right? Which I think is even telling about what we talked about brings God's judgment, right? Is is as much failure of image bearers. And so we get this interesting, so if we keep that in mind, Brandon, this turns into chapter 63 more and more of, look at verse 15. So look down from heaven and see. So now this is the people of God speaking back to God. Look down from heaven and see from your holy and beautiful habitation, right, from your temple. And they start asking, where are your zeal and your might? The stirring of your inner parts and your compassion are held back from me. For you are our Father, although Abraham does not know us and Israel does not acknowledge us. So there's a sense of like apartness from Israel, the people of God, right? You, O Lord, are our Father, our Redeemer from of old is your name. O Lord, why do you make us wander from your ways and harden our hearts so that we fear you not? So that's an internal question. That is a there's something wrong with us question. Return for the sake of your servants, the tribes of your heritage. Your holy people held possession for a little while. Our adversaries have trampled down your sanctuary, so they have not yet apparently rebuilt the temple at this point. We have become like those over whom you have never ruled, like those who are not called by your name. And then this sort of plea, oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down. This is post-exilic. This is when you go back to your parents' house or to your high school and you so want it to be the same. And it's like freshman year and you're just dying for like familiarity. And yet like it's not quite home. Or maybe it's definitely not home. My parents moved in between my sophomore and junior year of college and it was so bizarre, right? And then you're like going home and you're like, I might as well be, like college is more home to me than this, right? It is this sense of all of our hope was in return from exile, right? Like when we were walking back, we were like those who dreamed, right? Like don't make this an allegory. Like people are leaving Babylon, going back to the land they were promised. They're going to rebuild the temple, and yet they're like, and we know from the prophet Haggai, and from if you go back and read Ezra and Nehemiah, there's external threats, and there's actually worse than that, there's internal threats. So the people of God are frustrated with one another, and they're fighting, and God's withholding blessing in Haggai, right? And saying like, hey, y'all are building your houses, but you're not rebuilding the temple. And so there's just this sense of like, man, we thought this was going to be the solution to our problems. And there is nothing like second tier disappointment, right? Like first tier is bad, but you're like, okay, I can rally, right? Like there's a sense of like, okay. And this is like second tier disappointment. This is, we thought we were going home, and yet we feel exiled here. Somebody was telling me, a friend who's in a relationship, and we were talking about loneliness, and she was saying, I think it's lonelier to be in relationship and lonely than it is to be single. We're like, yeah, that's absolutely a common category, right? This sense of the tension of exile. And so we end up with, I think, what is actually a really helpful paradigm for us as believers, living in between Jesus and the final realization, like the final day, right? Which is, sometimes it feels like, God, why are you so mad at us? What's wrong with us? Why do you hide your face from us? And yet at the same time, we're incredibly joyful and privileged and thankful, right? And aware that without Jesus, like, we are lost and without hope and without God in the world, right? So we live in this tension that is the end of Isaiah, right? That is at times, and you know who writes apocalyptic literature? Persecuted people. People who are losing hope and despairing, right? Like, these are people who are questioning everything, right? And I think that causes us to do two things, right? When we're in those places, and maybe some of you guys are in that place even now, which I would imagine is true, right? It's a very real and I think somewhat frequent place for believers to live. And we should expect that of our lives, that we just live in tension, right? Sometimes experiencing, right? It's the Hebrews chapter on faith where it's like, And some people like got eaten by lions and like, you know, tortured and beaten, right? And other people like were healed and like brought back to life from the dead. And there's no sense of like, and if you got that, Xavier, it's because you did something right. And if you got persecuted, Victoria, sorry about your life. This is where we live as Christians, right? In our own lived experience. Walter Brueggemann, who's a famous Old Testament scholar, talks about we need to be careful of singing the songs of salvation if we haven't sung the songs of exile. Right? I think that's why Isaiah doesn't end with 62, right? And that those songs of salvation inevitably include judgment. And what that looks like and how, but if we, is confusing at best, right? And I am certainly not going to draw a diagram for you of how the end times are going to play out. Because I have no idea. And if I did, I would have my own show on television. Right? But whatever it looks like God is a righteous judge. He is. He is. Right? But he's also coming to redeem and save and bring us into a new creation. So, and I think our role in the meantime, and this is where I'll end this a little early, unless people have questions, which I do, is in Isaiah 62. And I think it's interesting that he goes back to calling the city Jerusalem at this point. And I'm wondering if that's because it doesn't feel like Zion. On your walls, O Jerusalem, I have set watchmen all the day and all the night. They shall never be silent. You who put the Lord in remembrance, take no rest. You who know the Lord. You who know what he's up to in the world. And give the Lord no rest until he establishes Jerusalem and makes it a praise in the earth. Right? That we're not just passively waiting. Right? We have stuff to do. We've got image bearing, we've got culture making, we've got contending with God. Right? For what he's promised. Any thoughts? Questions? Responses? Yeah, Lily.
I guess my response that comes to mind is that I feel like not we as an HCFA, but maybe my background in Christianity, we talk so much about the judgment part and who's gonna be saved and who's not gonna be saved, and we sit in that tension so much. And then I know we talk about this in HCFA, how we often misinterpret the good news and just be Jesus came and died to save us from our sins. And I literally just wrote in all caps down right now, why is this talk the best kept secret of Christianity? Because it almost feels like this is such good news. This is good news. And this is something that why wouldn't you want to share this? That is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think maybe just personally, I still get caught up in the it almost seems like we don't, as Christians as a whole, talk about this enough, right? It's just this is our hope. This is everything. I don't know.
I think it takes a lot of work and a lot of perseverance, right? And you guys, we have you for 4 years and we feel a lot of pressure, in a good way, positive pressure, to really, I think, get to this in the sense that, think how much is going into this, right? I think our theology of salvation has to be as big as our theology of creation, right? If God made the whole world, then we have to have a good news that is the shape of the whole world, right? It has to be that enormous, right? And that comprehensive. And I think it's just, I don't know, Lily. Yeah, I think it's we love pat answers and to boil everything down so and oversimplify it. But I totally agree. I think this is really wonderful news. But it's also, it's nuance, you know? like there's also some complexity, I think, that can take work. Thoughts or responses? Yeah, Veronica.
For my part, I think it's a lot easier to trust in the reality of a strong relationship than the things that relationship was promised. So like, I know Jesus, I know like what he looks like and what it looks like to follow him, and I like get a lot of joy out of that. That's something that I feel very tangibly, like whatever the already part of Christianity is something I feel very tangibly.
Yes.
And the not yet seems like it can still not happen. Like you shouldn't think that, but like it's a lot easier to focus on the parts that are
Totally. Yeah, the filling up the space between, especially when, I mean, we all know this, right? It's no secret that we live the most privileged lives, right, of anyone on the face of the planet before this. And in, like, yeah, it's just ridiculous how, I talk to my girls all the time about, Christianity is not a win-win, right? It's not like, I'm gonna do everything I can to have a great life here, and then bonus, Jesus, right? That the shape of faith is the more and more weight, increasing amount of weight on, if this isn't true, holy crap, which I have on the reg. You know, I feel as we have, Kelly's laughing because we've actually had this conversation, right? I think it is scary. There's a sense of wow, if this isn't true, my whole life is at stake here, and my future, and, but if it is true, man, this is some good news. And I think, God has so much patience. I don't say that to freak anyone out. I think it's a journey of discipleship, right? Of increasing, what does that mean? And that's where I think that the new creation piece can also be helpful for us, in that, even what God is, he's so unbelievably committed to process. He's so unbelievably committed to think of all the cultures and peoples and inventions and absolute sort of cycles, life cycles this planet has been through in terms of people. And it's wow, and redemptive history continues to unfold. And I just think God is incredibly interested in the details and in the development and that same thing in our own lives, that as we continue to pursue him, that there's new creation happening in our own lives and spheres in that same way. And I think there will continue, it's not the city's going to get to a place and then it's going to be stagnant, right? That God is a creative God, and there will be there will always be creating, right? Which means that there's always movement towards something and never arrival at it. And what great hope that same God is doing a work in us, right? That he is so interested in our trajectory and our heart towards him and our process, and not just well, if you would hurry up and get there. That's a good word. Yeah, Veronica, I appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's just pretty standard.
What did you mean, Veronica, about feeling the now but not like? You said something about you could imagine the not yet not happening or something?
Yeah, I know what it is to be a Christian on earth, and go to church and sometimes pray with somebody and sort of feel like God is right there with you, and to see when you make a sacrifice to God, and to sort of see that investment go on. It's so cool. But I don't know what it's like to be a Christian in heaven, so it's harder for me to meditate on or take action based on.
Okay.
My other thought related to that is that we are in a cool place where we can, this is where our imagination, I think, can be stretched. And so, how often do we all quote Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis, which is amazing. And I would love for you guys to consider strongly a calling in that direction. And of you who might be writers, right? But there is something, if you're not a writer, don't do it. Just do something else. We don't need more bad literature. But, right, like the expansion of our imagination, like how many of us, when we, like, Aslan was so critical in our understanding of God, right? And in our imagining of God, right? I actually know that that's part of Alexis' story, right? Like that there is this thing that happens when we're removed from our own world and moved into either a world, like an imaginary world in that sense, or even like when we travel, when we interact with, right? Like the bigness of God's creation should inspire us to remember the bigness of God's redemption, right? That he is doing things in other places and among other people and in other times, if we read church history, that are just, are helpful, I think, checks on what is at least my very sort of default setting to just think, like, God is as big as he is in my life and in the lives of the people I know.
Question to you about something at the end of chapter 66.
Yeah.
They talk about in the very last verse, they'll
Yes.
go out and look at the dead bodies of the man who was all against me. And then I'm just curious about the phrase, "For their worms shall not die, and the fire shall not be quenched." And if you have any thoughts on what people have said those things mean, like their worms shall not die. So clearly, like she's talking about dead bodies.
Yeah. So that is like curse language. So starting in the Old Testament, the idea of like anything. First of all, any body that's exposed, a dead body that's exposed, is under curse, right?
Under curse.
Yeah. So you get any like when bodies aren't buried for Israel, like if you want some less than encouraging reading. Deuteronomy 28. Wasting, disease, fever, inflammation, and fiery heat, with drought, with blight, with mildew. It shall pursue you until you perish. There's a, okay, right there. The Lord shall cause you to, so this is the Israel signs up for the covenant. They say, right, you know that the Mosaic covenant had attached to it not unconditional blessing like the Abrahamic covenant, right? Or the Davidic covenant, not God's going to do this no matter what, but hey, Israel, you keep your part, God will keep his part. You don't keep your part, you're signing up for curses, right? So blessings or curses, depending on. And of course, they end up being disobedient. We all know the end of that story. But it's actually interesting to read the prophets in light of the curses, because a lot of that same language just gets picked up as like indictment and sort of punitive measures for their disobedience. And in verse 25, the Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You shall go out one way against them and flee 7 ways before them. You shall be a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. The opposite of Isaiah 60, right? 61. Mm-hmm. And your dead body shall be food for all birds of the air, for the beasts of the earth, and there shall be no one to frighten them away. And then it goes on, with some more stuff. But there's, that particularly is like curse language, and also fire language is judgment language, right? So, that's all I got.
So worms shall not die, like the animals, the birds will continue to eat you?
Yeah. Kind of this idea that like you will be exposed to the ultimate kind of curse. And so that's always the question of like, what is the ultimate curse?
Yeah, Jesus quotes this.
He does, he does. Well, I'm not cheering.
Yeah, someone asked about something more.
No, that was a great question. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much. It's been so fun to do Isaiah with y'all. We're doing Mark in the fall, for any of you who hadn't heard. Also, I Heather, can you shut that off? Things before.
Whoa.
I know. Serious business.